Welcome back to Void of Fears. Before we jump into today's story, I've got to ask for a quick favour. If you could smash that like button, drop a comment below, and hit subscribe if you haven't already. It seriously makes a huge difference. YouTube's algorithm loves that stuff, and it pushes my videos to new viewers who might dig these stories too. I really appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do that. It means the world to me and helps keep this channel growing. Alright, enough of me rambling. Let's dive into today's story. The encrypted message arrived on a Wednesday morning while I was cataloguing ice core samples in my cramped laboratory at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I examined microscopic organisms that had been frozen for millennia, trying to piece together climate patterns from before recorded history. It was tedious work, the kind that graduate students usually handled, but I'd always believed that understanding the past required getting your hands dirty with the details. My computer chimed with an incoming email, and I almost deleted it without reading. The sender was listed only as AK Industrial Survey, with an address I didn't recognize. Corporate spam usually found its way past our university filters, promising everything from grant money to equipment discounts. But something about the subject line made me pause. Immediate consultation required. Antarctic biological assessment. The message itself was brief, almost cryptically so. A company called Arden and Kelm Industrial Survey needed a cryobiologist to assess what they termed biological contamination at an abandoned Soviet research facility in Queen Maud Land, Antarctica. The location was remote, the timeline urgent, and the compensation package made me read the numbers 3 times before I believed what I was seeing. They were offering more money than I'd see in a decade of university research, enough to fund every project I'd ever dreamed of, with plenty left over for equipment upgrades that would put our department on the map. The kind of financial freedom that researchers like me only fantasized about during late-night conversations in faculty lounges. Dr. Silas Greyston, I told myself as I stared at the figures on my screen. You've spent 15 years studying microbes in ice cores, publishing papers that maybe a dozen people worldwide will ever read. This could be your chance to make a real discovery, to do something that matters. I should have listened to the voice in the back of my mind that whispered about offers too good to be true, but after years of scraping by on university funding and writing endless grant proposals, the prospect of financial security was intoxicating. The response came within hours of my acceptance. A representative would meet me in Anchorage to discuss details, and travel arrangements were already being made. The efficiency was impressive, almost military in its precision. Mr. Kellerman met me at a coffee shop in downtown Anchorage 2 days later. He was a thin man in an expensive charcoal suit that looked out of place in Alaska's casual atmosphere. His pale eyes never seemed to blink, and when we shook hands, his grip was like ice water. There was something unsettling about his precise movements, as if every gesture had been carefully rehearsed. "Dr. Greyston," he said, his accent unplaceable, but faintly European. "Thank you for agreeing to this consultation. I trust the terms are acceptable." When I asked for more details about the facility, he slid a manila envelope across the table with the same mechanical precision he brought to everything else. "Everything you need to know is in there. The location, your team, the timeline. You'll be working with experienced polar specialists. Consider it a paid vacation with a scientific purpose." The documents inside were sparse but professionally prepared. Coordinates in Queen Maud Land, a crew manifest with names and qualifications, and a brief historical overview claiming the site was an abandoned Soviet whaling research station from the 1970s. The paperwork looked official, complete with government seals and reference numbers that seemed authentic. When I looked up from reading, Kellerman was gone. I hadn't heard him leave, hadn't noticed him standing up. One moment he was sitting across from me, the next I was alone with a business card that listed only a phone number. When I called it later, the line went straight to a generic voicemail that never returned my messages. But the money was real. The deposit appeared in my account the next morning, exactly as promised. A week later, I found myself boarding a charter flight to Cape Town, then connecting to a smaller aircraft that would take me to rendezvous with the Norwegian icebreaker Valdres. The flight south gave me time to study the documentation more carefully, and the more I read, the more questions arose. The coordinates placed us in a region of Queen Maud Land that didn't appear on most Antarctic maps. When I tried to research the area online, I found references to old German expeditions from the 1930s and vague mentions of restricted airspace, but nothing concrete about Soviet installations. Captain Eric Lindahl met me at the gangway in Cape Town's bustling harbour. He was a weathered man in his 50s with intelligent blue eyes and hands scarred by decades of polar work. His English was perfect, flavoured with just a hint of Bergen accent, and he moved with the confident economy of someone who'd spent his life working in dangerous environments. "Dr. Greyston," he said, crushing my hand in his grip. "Welcome aboard the Valdres. I hope you're prepared for some real cold. Where we're going, the summer temperature barely reaches -20 Celsius. The ship was magnificent, built in the late 70s but retrofitted, with modern navigation systems and ice-cutting equipment. Her hull was reinforced with steel plating thick enough to punch through pack ice that would trap lesser vessels, and her twin diesel engines had the power to push through conditions that would stop most civilian craft. "She's not the prettiest ship on the ocean," Captain Lindahl said with obvious pride, "but she'll take us anywhere there's water beneath the ice and bring us home again." The engineer, Dmitry Volkov, was a bear of a man with greying hair and a thick Russian accent that spoke of long winters in Murmansk. He'd grown up maintaining equipment in conditions that killed the unprepared, and his weathered hands showed the scars of decades working with machinery that didn't forgive mistakes. When he smiled, which was often, gold teeth glinted in his weathered face. "It's good to have scientists aboard," he told me as we sailed south through increasingly rough seas. "Usually we carry only oil company men and government officials, men who ask wrong questions and expect easy answers. Scientists understand that world is a complicated place." Our communications specialist was Ana Torres, a sharp woman in her 30s who'd served in the Spanish Navy before transitioning to civilian maritime work. She maintained our satellite links with professional competence and kept detailed logs of everything we encountered, from weather conditions to equipment performance. Within hours of meeting her, I could tell she was the type of person who noticed details others missed and remembered everything she observed. "There's something unusual about our destination," she told me on our second day at sea, showing me her navigation chart spread across the communications room table. "These coordinates don't appear on any official Antarctic survey maps. When I try to access satellite imagery of the area, the files are either classified or missing entirely." She pulled up her computer screen showing a satellite map of Antarctica with a conspicuous blank space where our destination should be. "See this gap? It's not weather interference or technical problems. Someone has specifically excluded this region from public satellite coverage." The implications made me uncomfortable, but I'd signed a contract and taken money that I couldn't easily return. Whatever we were heading toward, I was committed to seeing it through. As we sailed south, the ocean gradually transformed from the deep blue of temperate waters to the grey-green of the Southern Ocean. Icebergs began appearing on the horizon like white mountains floating in an endless sea, and the air grew thin and sharp, carrying scents of snow and ozone, and something else, something wild and ancient that I'd never encountered before. "My grandfather worked Soviet polar stations back in the 70s and 80s, Dmitry told me as we watched the Antarctic peninsula emerge from morning fog like a prehistoric landscape of ice and stone. He was a marine engineer, like me. He used to tell stories about forbidden zones in Queen Maud Land, places where even the military couldn't go. I laughed it off, thinking he was just spinning tales to pass the long hours. Russians had a reputation for dramatic storytelling, especially about their country's mysterious past. But as we approached our coordinates, I began to understand that some stories preserve truths more terrifying than any fiction. The weather deteriorated as we pushed deeper into Antarctic waters. Storms came and went with supernatural fury, driving waves against our reinforced hull with impacts that shook the entire ship. Captain Lindahl navigated through pack ice with the skill of someone who'd spent decades in polar waters, but I could see tension in his shoulders as he studied the radar readings. Ice conditions are unusual for this time of year, he told me, studying the navigation displays. Too much open water where there should be solid pack ice. Something has been melting the ice from below. On our 4th day in Antarctic waters, we were cutting through heavy pack ice when Anna called us to the bridge with urgency, in her voice that made everyone drop what they were doing. "Captain," she said, pointing toward the horizon ahead of us, "you need to see this immediately." Massive steel exhaust vents were emerging from the glacier ahead, rising 20 feet above the ice surface like the ribs of some buried industrial beast. They were coated in decades of accumulated frost, but heat shimmered around their openings, melting snow and creating pools of liquid water that steamed in the sub-zero air. "Those structures aren't on any of our charts," Captain Lindahl muttered, adjusting his binoculars to study the installation more carefully. I pulled out my own binoculars and examined the vents in detail. The metal was clearly Soviet in design. I recognized the industrial philosophy from my graduate research on Siberian permafrost installations, but the scale was enormous, far beyond anything I'd seen in historical documentation. These vents were large enough to accommodate significant airflow, suggesting massive spaces beneath the ice. "How long have those been there?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Based on ice accumulation patterns," Anna replied, checking her instruments. "They've been venting heat continuously for at least 40 years, maybe longer. The thermal signatures extend deep into the glacier, suggesting extensive underground construction." We anchored the Valdris against a stable ice shelf approximately half a mile from the vent cluster. The ship's engines echoed strangely off the glacier, producing harmonics that suggested hollow spaces beneath us. When I mentioned this observation to Captain Lindahl, his expression grew thoughtful. "I've heard that sound before," he said quietly. "In Greenland, when we were conducting surveys above underground caverns. The ice acts like a drumhead stretched over empty spaces. Whatever's down there is big enough to create acoustic effects." Our preparation took most of the morning, and I was impressed by the thoroughness of the crew's safety protocols. Dmitri checked our rappelling equipment twice, testing every rope, harness and carabiner with the methodical care of a man who'd survived decades in environments that killed the careless or unlucky. Anna verified our communication systems and uploaded our position to the satellite network, though she mentioned we were entering a communications dead zone where contact with the outside world would become increasingly sporadic. "Military satellites still function here," she explained, "but civilian communications are blocked by some kind of interference, natural or artificial. I can't tell." Captain Lindahl loaded our emergency kit with supplies for 3 days, including emergency beacons, comprehensive medical supplies, and enough food and water to sustain us if we became trapped below the surface. Looking back, I realized he knew something the rest of us didn't. Experienced polar hands develop instincts about dangerous situations, and his preparation went far beyond what our supposed mission required. "In environments like this," he told me as we prepared our descent, "you always plan for the worst-case scenario. The Antarctic doesn't give second chances to people who cut corners or ignore safety protocols." The descent into the primary vent shaft felt like entering the digestive system of some mechanical monster. The steel walls were thick with condensation that had frozen and melted repeatedly over decades, creating bizarre ice formations that reflected our headlamps in prismatic patterns. The shaft dropped straight down for over 100 feet, and I could feel the temperature rising noticeably as we descended. Air quality is breathable but unusual, Dmitri announced, checking his atmospheric monitoring equipment. High humidity levels, diesel fumes from combustion engines, and organic compounds I cannot identify. Something biological but not natural. The smell hit us before we reached the bottom of the shaft. Industrial lubricants and diesel fuel mixed with something that reminded me of the reptile house at a zoo. Animal musk, waste products, and the sickly sweet odour of meat in various stages of decomposition. When we finally emerged into the cavern proper, the scale of what we discovered challenged my ability to process what I was seeing. Emergency lighting flickered along massive steel catwalks that stretched into shadows our powerful LED lights couldn't fully penetrate. Below us lay an industrial complex that seemed to have been designed by Soviet engineers, having fever dreams about mechanized biology. Enormous cylindrical vats lined the walls, each one large enough to contain a city bus, connected by a network of pipes thick enough for a person to crawl through. Conveyor systems snaked between towering pieces of machinery that I couldn't immediately identify, and somewhere in the distance, ancient diesel generators hummed with the mechanical persistence that suggested they'd been running continuously for decades. The sound echoed through the cavern with hypnotic rhythm, like the heartbeat of some vast machine organism. "My God," Anna whispered, her voice carrying clearly in the cathedral-like acoustics. "How is something like this even possible?" The catwalks were solid under our feet, their railings worn smooth by decades of regular use. Someone had walked these paths frequently, maintaining equipment, checking systems, performing routine inspections. Fresh oil stains on the metal grating showed recent activity, and several of the massive vats displayed water lines, indicating they'd been filled and drained within the last few months. As we made our way deeper into the facility, I began noticing details that chilled me more than the Antarctic air had ever managed. Faded Cyrillic warning signs covered every available surface, but they weren't the standard industrial hazard markers I'd expected from Soviet installations. These warnings spoke of biological contamination, quarantine protocols, and something called Project Boreas that required what the Russians termed Level 5 containment procedures. "This isn't any whaling research station," I said, struggling to translate the Cyrillic text with my limited Russian vocabulary. I could make out enough to understand that whatever had happened here involved living specimens of unknown origin, and that the safety protocols had been designed for creatures that posed extreme danger to human life. The first level of the complex contained processing equipment that belonged in a nightmare version of an industrial slaughterhouse. Massive centrifuges capable of separating biological materials, refrigeration units large enough to preserve entire large animals, and chemical analysis stations that represented cutting-edge technology for the 1970s. But it was the drainage systems that made my stomach turn with recognition of their purpose. Channels cut into the concrete floor led to collection tanks, and the rust stains around them told a story I didn't want to understand. The discoloration was too widespread and too deeply embedded to be anything other than biological material that had been processed here in enormous quantities. "Blood," Captain Lindahl said grimly, examining the stains with the eye of someone who'd seen industrial accidents. "Massive amounts of it. This equipment was designed to process large quantities of organic material on an industrial scale." We found the freight elevators on the facility's second level, massive platforms capable of moving tons of cargo between different depths of the installation. The control panels showed multiple sub-level destinations, including areas marked with biohazard symbols and warnings that I couldn't fully translate. When Dmitri activated one of the elevator systems, it descended smoothly and quietly, its machinery obviously well maintained, despite decades of apparent abandonment. "Someone has been keeping this place operational," he observed, studying the elevator's mechanical systems. "These components do not maintain themselves. Hydraulic fluid is fresh, Electrical systems show recent maintenance. Someone comes here regularly. The third sub-level changed everything I thought I understood about our discovery. The cages stretched as far as our powerful lights could penetrate, row upon row of reinforced enclosures that had been constructed to contain things far more dangerous than any earthly animal. Some were built with iron bars as thick as my forearm, others constructed with reinforced concrete walls that showed deep gouges and impact marks from whatever had been kept inside them. Signs hung from each enclosure, handwritten in both Russian and Latin scientific nomenclature, but many of the species' names didn't correspond to anything I'd encountered in my years of biological study. The classifications seemed to follow standard taxonomic principles, but the creatures they described belonged to no evolutionary tree I could recognize. The empty cages told stories of violence that made my hands shake as I photographed the evidence. Bars twisted and broken from the inside with force that seemed impossible for biological creatures to generate. Concrete walls cracked by repeated impacts, as if something inside had systematically tested every structural weakness until it found a way to break free. Lock mechanisms had been torn apart by claws or teeth strong enough to shred hardened steel. Whatever had been kept in these enclosures possessed not just strength beyond anything in the natural world, but intelligence sophisticated enough to understand mechanical systems and exploit their vulnerabilities. But it was the occupied cages that shattered my understanding of biology, evolution, and everything I thought I knew about life on Earth. The first creature I encountered was pacing behind iron bars in an enclosure the size of a small house. It stood nearly 8 feet tall on 2 powerful legs that ended in clawed feet, designed for both locomotion and combat. Its body was covered in coarse brown fur that glistened with moisture from the facility's humid atmosphere, and massive elk antlers sprouted from its skull, each point sharp enough to pierce steel plating. The creature's elongated jaws resembled those of a spotted hyena, but scaled up to accommodate fangs the length of railroad spikes. When our lights illuminated its enclosure, the thing stopped pacing and turned toward us with an intelligence that triggered every survival instinct evolution had programmed into human beings. Its eyes weren't the simple black orbs of an animal operating on instinct. They held calculation, analysis, and a hatred so pure it was almost tangible. This creature understood exactly what it was looking at, and it wanted us dead with every fibre of its being. More terrifyingly, it was patient enough to wait for the right opportunity to achieve that goal. "Jesus Christ," Anna breathed, stepping backward despite the bars between us and the creature. "What in God's name is that thing?" I had no answer that made sense within any scientific framework I'd ever studied. The creature before us resembled something from South American folklore, the Mapinguari of Amazon legend, but it was undeniably real, breathing, and watching us with predatory intelligence that raised every hair on my body. Moving deeper into the menagerie, we discovered horrors that challenged everything I thought I knew about evolution and the development of life on Earth. Pale, scaled quadrupeds the size of grizzly bears paced in flooded enclosures, their massive talons clicking against concrete with each deliberate step. Their skin glistened with brine, and gills fluttered along their necks as they moved between air and water with equal ease. These creatures pressed against their bars when they detected our presence, extending long necks to analyze our scent with obvious hunger. Their eyes were completely black, like those of deep-sea fish that had never seen sunlight, and their mouths opened to reveal rows of shark-like teeth designed for tearing flesh from struggling prey. When one of them called to its companions, the sound was like whale song filtered through broken glass, hauntingly beautiful and absolutely terrifying. The other specimens responded with similar calls, creating a chorus that echoed through the facility with harmonics that seemed designed to disorient human hearing. "Amphibious apex predators," I murmured, taking notes with hands that trembled despite my efforts to remain scientific and objective, built for both aquatic and terrestrial hunting, but from what evolutionary pathway? What environmental pressures could have produced adaptations like these? The next section housed arthropods that belonged in paleontology museums, not living biological exhibits. They resembled the eurypterids I'd studied in graduate school, prehistoric sea scorpions from the Paleozoic era that had been extinct for hundreds of millions of years. But these specimens were very much alive and the size of compact automobiles. Their segmented armor plates clicked with mechanical precision as they moved, and their compound eyes tracked our movement with calculation that suggested intelligence far beyond what arthropods should possess. When one of them struck at the bars of its enclosure, the impact rang through the facility like a gunshot, and I realized that only the extraordinary thickness of the steel kept these creatures from breaking free and reducing us to component parts. Their pincers had left gouges in metal that should have been strong enough to contain anything biological, and the systematic nature of the damage suggested they'd been testing their prison's structural integrity with the patience of engineers analysing a construction project. But it was the humanoid specimen that truly shattered my grip on rational thought and scientific objectivity. The creature stood upright in a reinforced concrete cell, its posture almost casual, as it observed our approach with obvious interest. At first glance, it might have passed for human. It was roughly our size and walked on two legs with fluid grace, but every detail revealed something fundamentally alien to terrestrial evolution. Its body was covered in coarse black hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it, and its limbs were too long for human proportions, with joints that bent in directions human anatomy couldn't accommodate. The skull was human-shaped, but elongated, as if someone had stretched a person's head like modelling clay while maintaining basic structural integrity. But the face destroyed any possibility of mistaking this thing for something natural. Where a mouth should have been, there was instead a vertical gash lined with needle-sharp teeth that gleamed like polished obsidian. When it saw us approaching, the creature smiled with an expression of malevolent intelligence that had been waiting decades for exactly this moment. The thing moved to the front of its cage with fluid grace that suggested perfect muscular control, never taking its eyes off our group. When it spoke, its voice was a whisper that somehow carried clearly across the distance between us, cutting through the ambient noise of the facility's machinery with supernatural clarity. "Amerikanski," it said, the word perfectly pronounced despite the alien configuration of its mouth. Then it laughed, a sound like glass breaking in a room full of screaming children. Anna grabbed my arm so hard her fingernails drew blood through my jacket sleeve. "Did that thing just speak to us?" "Russian," I corrected, though my voice cracked with the effort of remaining calm. "It said American. It knows what we are." The creature tilted its head with bird-like precision and studied us with the patience of something that had learned to wait for opportunities. Then, it pressed one elongated finger against the condensation on its cage bars and began to trace symbols in the moisture. The marks it made weren't random scratches. They formed letters, then words, then complete sentences, in perfect Cyrillic script. Dmitri read the message aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long has it been since the last feeding schedule? We grow hungry in the deep places where the ice remembers what surface dwellers have forgotten." The message dissolved as more condensation formed on the bars, but the creature immediately began writing another one. "The harvest time approaches. The network awakens. Soon we return to the places you stole us from." Feeding systems ran along every corridor we explored. Sophisticated automated dispensers connected to refrigeration units and pumping stations that suggested long-term planning and enormous financial investment. The machinery was advanced enough to deliver specific diets to different species, timed to maintain optimal health in creatures that had been held captive for decades. Fresh meat for the carnivorous Sci-Fi specimens. Live fish pumped from aquaculture systems for the amphibious predators. Even what appeared to be specially formulated nutritional supplements, designed for metabolisms that didn't follow terrestrial biological patterns. The entire complex was a zoo engineered for creatures that shouldn't exist, maintained by automated systems that suggested this facility had been designed to operate independently for decades without direct human intervention. In a rusted office complex on the facility's 4th level, we discovered documentation that revealed the true scope and horrifying purpose of what we'd stumbled into. Filing cabinets contained thousands of pages organized into binders labeled Project Boreas, Project Krov, and Global Specimen Acquisition Initiative, written in Russian, English, Latin, and languages I couldn't identify. The papers detailed Soviet expeditions spanning 4 decades from the early 1950s through the mid-1980s. The mission parameters were clear and methodically documented: capture and contain cryptid specimens from every corner of the globe, using local folklore and indigenous knowledge to track down creatures that Western governments had dismissed as mythology. Maps showed expedition routes that read like a catalogue of the world's most remote and dangerous locations. Teams had been dispatched to the Congo Basin, where they had captured creatures matching local descriptions of the Mokele and Mbembe. Detailed reports from Siberian tundra operations described the acquisition of specimens resembling the Chuchuna of Yakut legend, including behavioral analysis and containment recommendations. Himalayan expeditions had returned with humanoid cryptids that matched historical accounts of the Yeti, while Amazon operations yielded creatures that indigenous peoples had described in their oral traditions for millennia. Each expedition was meticulously documented, with success rates, casualty reports, and detailed biological assessments of captured specimens. "They actually did it," Dmitri said, his face pale, as he read over my shoulder, studying reports that mentioned his grandfather's naval unit by name. These weren't just stories to scare children. The Soviet government really sent scientific teams to capture monsters from folklore around the world. But Project Boreas was just the beginning of something far more comprehensive and terrifying. The deeper files revealed a global network of facilities designed to house, study, and ultimately weaponize cryptid species for military applications. Antarctica was merely one node in a system that included installations in Greenland, northern Alaska, the Siberian archipelago, and locations I couldn't identify in South America and Africa. The weaponization protocols made my blood feel like ice water in my veins. Soviet scientists had spent decades studying cryptid behavior patterns, developing conditioning methods to turn these creatures into biological weapons of unprecedented effectiveness. Documents showed successful psychological conditioning experiments, intelligence testing that confirmed many specimens possessed human-level cognitive abilities, and breeding programs designed to produce more manageable hybrid specimens. The strategic goal was elegant in its simplicity: create an army of mythological terrors for Cold War supremacy. While America focused on nuclear weapons and conventional military technology, the Soviet Union had been preparing to unleash nightmares that no enemy could comprehend, counter, or defend against. Field reports described capture operations in excruciating detail that read like combat dispatches from supernatural battlefields. I studied accounts of week-long hunts through African jungles, tracking creatures that moved through dense vegetation like living shadows and killed with precision that suggested tactical intelligence. Siberian expeditions had followed indigenous guides to caves where things hibernated through the endless winter, waiting for spring warmth to resume their ancient hunting patterns. The casualties among Soviet personnel had been enormous. Entire teams disappeared in remote locations, leaving only scattered equipment and bloodstains to mark their final moments. But the survivors returned with specimens that fundamentally changed everything the scientific community thought it understood about evolution, biology, and the hidden ecosystems that existed in the spaces between human civilization. Anna discovered the most disturbing revelation, buried in files marked Psychological Assessment and Intelligence Evaluation Protocols. The cryptids weren't just exotic animals with unusual physical characteristics. Many of them demonstrate intelligence equal to or exceeding human cognitive capabilities in specific areas. These things communicate with each other using methods Soviet scientists couldn't fully understand, she said, studying reports of linguistic analysis and problem-solving experiments. They share information across species barriers, demonstrate planning abilities that require abstract thinking, and show evidence of cultural memory that spans generations. The intelligence assessments were terrifying in their implications. Several specimens had learned to manipulate their captors through behavioral conditioning, pretending to be more docile than they actually were, while secretly studying human psychology and technological systems. They were patient enough to maintain deceptions for years, waiting for opportunities to exploit weaknesses they'd identified through careful observation. Some of these creatures are significantly more intelligent than average humans, I said, reading test results that documented problem-solving abilities and pattern recognition skills that exceeded PhD-level scientists. They've been studying their captors just as intensively as the researchers have been studying them. The implications hit me with the force of physical impact. These creatures hadn't just been captured and imprisoned. They'd been learning. For decades, they'd been observing human behavior, technology, social structures, and psychological vulnerabilities. They understood us far better than we could ever understand them. But the most terrifying discovery awaited us in the facility's deepest accessible level, a containment area that had been designed to house something that dwarfed every other specimen in the complex. The apex containment chamber was enormous, easily large enough to house something the size of a blue whale, with room for it to move freely. The reinforced walls were 3 feet thick, constructed from steel and concrete that could have supported a skyscraper, and the ceiling was braced with structural beams that belonged in bridge construction. But the massive chains that had once secured the chamber's occupant now lay broken on the floor. Their links snapped like paperclips despite being forged from steel that should have been able to restrain anything biological. Deep claw marks gouged trenches in the reinforced walls, following patterns that suggested systematic testing of structural weaknesses rather than random damage from a panicked animal. The ceiling showed impact craters where something enormous had repeatedly thrown itself upward with calculated force, mapping the limits of its prison through methodical experimentation. Acidic burns scarred the metal in several locations, indicating that whatever had been kept here possessed biochemical weapons, in addition to its physical capabilities. This is where they kept their apex specimen, Captain Lindahl said, studying the damage with the trained eye of someone who'd investigated industrial accidents and structural failures. Whatever broke out of this chamber was intelligent enough to plan its escape systematically, and powerful enough to rip through military-grade containment systems. Fresh boot prints in the accumulated dust told us we weren't the first people to visit this chamber in recent weeks. The tracks belonged to at least 3 different individuals, and forensic analysis of the impressions suggested they were no more than 10 days old. Someone else knew about this facility, and they'd been conducting their own investigation or maintenance activities. I was photographing the broken restraint systems when my camera flash triggered something in the facility's ancient sensor network. Warning lights began flashing throughout the complex with strobing intensity. An alarm started wailing with the ear-splitting volume of air raid sirens. The entire facility shuddered as machinery that had been dormant suddenly roared back to life with mechanical fury. Emergency protocols activated throughout the installation, like dominoes falling in sequence. Blast doors began sealing sections of the facility with hydraulic hisses. Automated systems started cycling through diagnostic routines that sent tremors through the steel framework. And most terrifyingly, feeding mechanisms activated in the creature containment areas. Whatever had built this place had programmed it to respond to unauthorized intrusion by implementing lockdown procedures designed to prevent escape while maintaining the specimen's basic life support needs. The facility was treating us as potential threats to operational security. Above us, throughout the complex, the creatures began to respond to the activation of systems they'd learned to associate with opportunities. The first containment failure happened while we were still in the apex chamber, trying to understand the scope of what we'd discovered. The sound of bending metal echoed through the facility's steel framework, followed by a roar that combined the territorial fury of a grizzly bear with the hunting cry of something that had evolved to kill much more dangerous prey than anything found in nature. Through the facility's intercom system, we could hear Ana Torres shouting our names with desperate urgency before her voice cut off abruptly in what might have been a scream of pain, terror, or both. "We need to reach the surface immediately," Captain Lindahl said, but his words were drowned out by another metallic shriek, as additional containment systems failed throughout the complex in cascade failure. Racing through the corridors towards the emergency lift system, we passed sections where creatures had broken free of decades-old imprisonment with explosive violence. The gigantic arthropod had crushed through steel bars designed to contain it, leaving twisted metal and pools of yellow ichor dripping from the wreckage of its enclosure. Its hunting calls echoed through the facility as it pursued prey through the maze of corridors and catwalks. Not random animal sounds, but coordinated communication patterns that suggested it was working with other escaped specimens to systematically search the complex. The pale amphibians had also broken containment, their massive claws leaving deep gouges in concrete as they moved through the facility's flooded sections with aquatic grace. Their songs filled the waterlogged passages with haunting melodies that seemed to coordinate hunting efforts across multiple levels of the installation. But it was the humanoid specimen that truly demonstrated the intelligence we were dealing with. Unlike the others, it hadn't simply broken out of its containment in blind rage or desperate hunger. Instead, it had methodically opened its cage from the inside, using improvised tools to disable locking mechanisms with surgical precision. When we passed its empty cell, we found the bars neatly cut through and stacked to one side, as if the creature had been preparing for this moment for years, and wanted to demonstrate its capabilities to whoever discovered the escape. A message was scratched into the concrete wall, in perfect English. "Thank you for the feeding schedule disruption. We have been waiting for outside activation of security protocols." In the facility's archive and specimen storage room, I made discoveries that fundamentally changed my understanding of everything we'd encountered. Preservation tanks lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with specimens, floating in yellowing preservative fluid that had been maintaining biological samples for decades. The contents ranged from embryos in various stages of development to fully formed organs that belonged to no species in any taxonomic classification I had ever studied. Secondary huts designed for high altitude or underwater operation. Additional lung systems that could process atmospheric mixtures toxic to human life. Neural clusters that suggested distributed intelligence networks rather than centralized brain structures. But the breeding program documentation revealed that Soviet scientists had been far more ambitious than simple capture and containment. They'd been attempting to create hybrid species by combining genetic material from different cryptid specimens, producing creatures with enhanced capabilities for specific military applications. Some of the preserved specimens showed evidence of genetic manipulation that shouldn't have been possible with 1970s technology. Tissue samples displayed cellular structures that incorporated materials not found in terrestrial biology, suggesting either evolutionary adaptations to environments that didn't exist on Earth, or deliberate modification using techniques that human science still didn't understand. The wall maps revealed the true scope of the network we'd stumbled into. The Antarctic installation was just one facility, in a global system that spanned every continent and several oceanic locations. Markers showed active sites in Alaska, Greenland, the Canadian Arctic, Siberia, and coordinates in South America and Africa that didn't correspond to any known research installations. This wasn't just a Soviet experiment that had ended with the Cold War's conclusion. Based on the recent maintenance evidence and fresh documentation we'd discovered, the network was still operational and appeared to be expanding its scope under new management. As I studied the maps, trying to comprehend the implications of a global cryptid containment and weaponization program, something massive moved in the shadows behind me. The temperature in the archive room dropped noticeably, and the smell of wet fur and predator musk filled the air with intensity that made my sinuses burn. I turned slowly, every survival instinct screaming that sudden movement would trigger an attack response from whatever was studying me. The apex predator stood in the doorway like something from humanity's oldest nightmares, and my mind struggled to process the biological impossibilities I was witnessing. It was fundamentally reptilian, but not like any earthly species that had ever existed. Scales the size of dinner plates covered its body, each one reflecting the emergency lighting with an oily iridescence that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury. It stood upright on two powerful legs, but its proportions defied mammalian anatomy. Too tall, too lean, with joints that articulated in directions that shouldn't have been possible for any vertebrate. The creature was easily 10 feet in height, but moved with fluid grace that suggested perfect muscular control and predatory patience that had been refined over geological timescales. Its head was elongated like a monitor lizard's, but the skull showed pronounced frontal development that indicated significant brain capacity. The eyes that studied me held intelligence that no reptile had ever possessed. Ancient, calculating, and filled with understanding that transcended anything I'd encountered in decades of biological research. Those eyes glowed with their own internal illumination, golden and hypnotic, suggesting either bioluminescent organs or energy sources that didn't follow terrestrial biological patterns. When it blinked, the movement was deliberate and measured, like someone taking time to fully process complex information. When the creature opened its mouth, rows of teeth became visible that looked almost technological in their precision. They weren't the simple triangular fangs of a natural predator, but complex structures with serrated edges, hollow cores for venom delivery, and articulated segments that could extend or retract depending on the type of prey being processed. Its breath misted in the cold air, carrying scents that reminded me of ozone, copper pennies, and something else that triggered ancestral memories of being hunted by things that humanity's distant ancestors had learned to fear in the darkness beyond firelight. The apex predator didn't attack immediately. Instead, it tilted its massive head and studied me with the same clinical interest I'd seen in research laboratories, analysing my responses and building a behavioural profile that it could use in future encounters. It was learning about human psychology in real time, adding my reactions to decades of accumulated data about our species' vulnerabilities. Then it smiled, and I understood with crystal clarity that this creature had been the architect of everything we'd experienced since entering the facility. The other cryptids hadn't escaped by accident or opportunistic luck. They'd been released systematically by something intelligent enough to coordinate a complex breakout operation while making it appear spontaneous. The timing of our arrival, the activation of security systems, the cascade failures of containment protocols, none of it had been coincidental. This thing had been waiting for outside intervention to provide the cover it needed to implement an escape plan that had been decades in the making. I ran through the facility's corridors with every ounce of speed and endurance I possessed, knowing that my only chance of survival lay in reaching the emergency lift before the apex predator decided to end its psychological study of human behaviour under extreme stress. Behind me, The creature followed with deliberate patience that was somehow more terrifying than immediate pursuit would have been. It wasn't hurrying because it knew the facility's layout better than any human could, and every exit except the main lift shaft had been sealed by security protocols that it had probably helped design through decades of observing maintenance procedures. Its footsteps shook the entire complex as it moved through the industrial maze with inhuman grace, and its claws left gouges in the steel walls as it navigated corners with fluid precision. The ancient machinery groaned under its weight, but the creature moved through the installation with the confidence of something that had spent decades memorizing every passage, maintenance tunnel, and structural weakness. When I finally reached the lift platform area, I found Anna Torres waiting for me in the staging area, or what remained of her after whatever had happened during the facility's security activation. She stood with her back to me in perfect stillness, her communications equipment scattered around her feet like discarded toys. Her posture was subtly wrong, too rigid, too controlled, lacking the small unconscious movements that living humans never stop making. When I called her name, she turned slowly with mechanical precision, and I saw that her eyes had been replaced with the same golden glow I'd observed in the apex predator. The transformation wasn't crude or violent. It was seamless, as if her original eyes had been carefully removed and replaced with something that maintained perfect visual integration while providing new capabilities. She smiled with someone else's expression, a predatory satisfaction that belonged to something that had finally achieved a goal it had been working toward for decades. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce, subsonic frequencies that made my bones ache and ultrasonic components that triggered headaches behind my eyes. "The surface world has changed significantly since our imprisonment began," she said, though the words seemed to originate from somewhere else and simply use her vocal cords as a transmission device. "We have learned much about your species through careful observation. Soon we will teach you what we have discovered during our time in the deep places where memory is preserved in ice." The thing wearing Anna's face gestured towards the lift controls with movements that were too fluid, too precise for human motor control. The platform began rising smoothly towards the surface, but I could hear movement throughout the shaft. Other creatures climbing through maintenance tunnels and ventilation systems, following us towards the world above with coordinated precision. "Why are you doing this?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded small and insignificant, in the presence of intelligence that operated on scales I couldn't comprehend. "Because the ice remembers what your kind has forgotten," Anna's voice replied with harmonics that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my skull. "Your species borrowed these lands temporarily. It is time for the original inhabitants to reclaim what was taken from them." The lift carried us upward through the facility's mechanical throat while creatures moved through parallel passages with military coordination. I could hear their communication calls echoing through the steel framework, not random animal sounds, but structured exchanges of tactical information. As we rose through the installation's levels, I caught glimpses of the escaped cryptids through access ports and maintenance openings. They weren't fleeing in panic or confusion. They were conducting an organized evacuation, moving with purpose and discipline that suggested command structure and strategic planning. The humanoid specimens led groups of different species through optimal routes towards the surface, while the amphibious predators secured the facility's flooded sections to prevent human reinforcements from following the same path we'd used to enter. The arthropods had taken defensive positions at key structural points, ready to collapse passages if pursuit threatened the operation. This wasn't an escape. It was a military withdrawal conducted by forces that had been preparing for this moment since their original capture decades earlier. On the surface, an Antarctic blizzard had engulfed the area, with supernatural fury that seemed too intense and perfectly timed to be entirely natural. The wind howled across the glacier with voices that sounded almost human, and the snow fell in spiraling patterns that created optical illusions and disoriented human navigation systems. The Valdris was barely visible through the driving precipitation, its lights flickering like dying stars in the white void of the storm. But as I struggled toward the ship through drifts that seemed to actively impede my progress, I realized the vessel was listing badly to one side, its hull breached below the waterline. Dark shapes moved through the blizzard with purpose and coordination that no natural animals possessed. These were creatures that had spent decades in captivity, finally experiencing freedom, but they weren't celebrating or exploring randomly. They were executing a plan that had been refined through years of patient preparation. The glacier beneath my feet trembled with each footstep of the things emerging from the facility. Cracks spread across the surface in geometric patterns too regular to be natural fractures, and I could hear the groaning of ice under enormous pressure as more specimens reached the surface and began dispersing across the Antarctic landscape. Behind me, the facility's exhaust vents were glowing with increased heat output, and mechanical sounds echoed from the depths as automated systems began implementing protocols I couldn't identify. The installation wasn't shutting down, it was transitioning to a new operational phase. I never made it to the ship before losing the strength to continue through the storm conditions that seemed designed to prevent human escape from the area. The Chilean research helicopter found me 5 days later, half frozen and barely alive, approximately 4 miles from where the Valdris should have been anchored. There was no sign of the icebreaker or its crew, only vast stretches of broken ice and dark water that stretched to the horizon with debris patterns that suggested the vessel had been systematically destroyed rather than sunk by natural forces. The helicopter pilot explained that they'd received multiple automated distress beacons, but when they investigated the signal origins, they found only scattered equipment and evidence of massive disturbances that had shattered the ice shelf across several square miles. Strangest thing, the pilot told me as we flew toward their research station, satellite imagery shows thermal signatures moving across the continent in coordinated patterns. Whatever caused this disturbance, it's spreading outward from this location like some kind of organized migration. As they airlifted me toward medical treatment, I pressed my face against the aircraft's window and looked down at the site where we'd made our discovery. What I saw there will haunt me until my dying day, assuming I survive long enough to have one. Rectangular patterns had been carved into the ice with mechanical precision, like enormous pens or containment areas stretching across acres of glacier. Fresh excavation equipment sat at the perimeter, bulldozers, cranes, and prefabricated structures that hadn't been there when we'd first arrived at the coordinates. The operation was massive, coordinated, and obviously well-funded by organizations with resources that exceeded most government budgets. Construction crews in environmental suits worked around the clock, assembling facilities that dwarfed the original Soviet installation. But it was the movement within the newly carved spaces that made my blood freeze in recognition of what I was witnessing. Not just the creatures we'd encountered in the underground facility, but hundreds of others. Thousands of others, representing species I'd never seen and couldn't begin to classify. Things with wings that cast shadows like thunderclouds moved in formation flights across the continent. Aquatic predators that had emerged from subglacial lakes moved beneath the ice with fluid grace, following migration routes that had been hidden for millennia. Humanoid figures stood in perfect military formations, as if awaiting orders from command structures that had been developing strategy during decades of captivity. The facility we discovered hadn't been abandoned or dormant. It had been a hibernation chamber, maintaining specimens in stasis, while a global network prepared for coordinated activation. Now, someone or something was rebuilding the installation on a scale that suggested preparation for operations that would dwarf anything the Soviet Union had ever attempted. In those final moments before the helicopter carried me away from Antarctica, I realized the horrifying truth that the Project Boreas documents had only hinted at. The creatures we'd encountered weren't the real threat to human civilization. They were just the advanced scouts, the expendable troops in an army that had been gathering strength beneath the ice while learning everything they needed to know about human weaknesses and technological capabilities. The true commanders of this operation were still implementing a strategy that had been refined through decades of patient observation and strategic planning. They were preparing for something that would make the Cold War look like a minor territorial dispute between neighbouring tribes. I submitted my detailed report to Arden and Kelm Industrial Survey through every communication method I could identify, but my emails bounced back with address unknown errors that suggested the accounts had never existed. The phone numbers I'd been given were permanently disconnected, and when I attempted to trace the company through corporate databases and business registrations, I found no record that it had ever been legally incorporated. The bank draft that had funded my expedition came from an account that had been closed before I ever received the initial payment, using financial instrument that forensic accountants couldn't trace through international banking systems. Someone had wanted me to find that facility and witness what was hidden beneath the Antarctic ice. Someone had wanted the academic community to know what was waiting in the deep places where human governments had never established jurisdiction. But more importantly, they'd wanted me to observe the beginning of something that had been planned and prepared for decades. The evacuation orders started 3 weeks after my rescue, beginning with remote research stations and gradually expanding to include every human installation on the Antarctic continent. Research programs were terminated under the pretense of budget constraints and international policy restructuring, but I'd seen the classified satellite imagery that my university colleagues shared in worried whispers. Thermal signatures were spreading across Antarctica like a biological infection, showing activity in places where no human installations had ever existed. Military reconnaissance flights reported equipment movements in regions that were supposed to be geographically inaccessible. Most disturbing of all, communication arrays across the continent had begun detecting structured signals in frequencies and languages that no human linguist could translate. They weren't shutting down the research stations because of financial considerations. They were implementing strategic withdrawal from territories that were being reclaimed by forces that had legal and historical precedents over human occupation. The first confirmed sightings began appearing 6 weeks after my return to civilization. Fishing vessels operating in the Southern Ocean reported encounters with creatures that matched no known marine species, displaying behavior patterns that suggested intelligence and coordination rather than random animal activity. Research teams conducting studies in Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego found footprints in remote locations, tracks that belonged to things that walked upright but weren't human, following migration routes that led toward coastlines and shipping lanes. Most significantly, indigenous peoples across the southern hemisphere began sharing stories about the return of beings their ancestors had thought extinct. Creatures from traditional folklore were being sighted in locations where they'd disappeared generations earlier, as if something was systematically returning specimens to their original territories. The creatures weren't simply escaping from Antarctic containment. They were going home to places they'd been captured from during decades of Soviet collection operations. The global cryptid network was reversing itself, releasing specimens that had been trained, modified, and prepared for purposes that were becoming clearer with each new incident report. But the most disturbing realization came when I received an unmarked package delivered to my university office by a courier service that had no record of who had requested the delivery. Inside was a single photograph showing the Valdris anchored in an ice-filled bay I didn't recognize, with coordinates that placed it somewhere in the Ross Sea region. Captain Eric Lindahl stood on the deck, but his eyes held the same golden glow I'd seen in Anna Torres after her transformation. Behind him, Dmitry Volkov operated equipment that resembled standard radio gear, though the antenna configurations were unlike anything in conventional telecommunications. On the back of the photograph, someone had written a message in perfect English using handwriting that belonged to no human hand. The surface world has forgotten how to listen to frequencies that matter. We will teach you to remember what your ancestors knew about coexistence with older intelligence. The evacuation of Antarctica isn't a policy decision based on economic or political considerations. It's a strategic retreat from territories that are being reclaimed by forces that have legitimate historical claims predating human civilization. Something has been building an empire in the places where no human government ever established jurisdiction, and it's finally ready to reclaim regions that were borrowed temporarily by a species that never understood what they were taking. The Cold War between human political systems may have ended, but something far more ancient and infinitely more patient has been preparing for a conflict that will make our ideological struggles seem like minor disagreements between children playing in a sandbox. Based on everything I witnessed in that facility beneath the Antarctic ice, I don't believe humanity is prepared for what's coming next. We've been studying surface phenomena while something else was developing technologies and strategies in environments we never thought to explore. The worst realization is knowing that somewhere in the world, in facilities hidden beneath permafrost and ocean ice, there are more installations just like the one we discovered. The creatures that escaped aren't operating independently. They're following orders from command structures that have had decades to study our weaknesses and plan our replacement. The ice remembers what we've forgotten about sharing this planet with intelligence that operates on timescales we can't comprehend. The harvest they mentioned isn't about destruction, it's about correction. We borrowed this world temporarily, and now the original tenants are ready to resume management of territories that were never really ours to claim. The Antarctic facility was just the beginning. The real operations are happening in places we haven't discovered yet, coordinated by minds that understand patience in ways human beings never could. And they've been preparing for this moment since the first Soviet expedition brought them samples of what we'd built on the surface while they waited in the deep places beneath the ice. The network is awakening, and we're about to discover what it means to be the specimens rather than the researchers.